Thank you, Nelson. So we are continuing on. This is week 4 of 10 weeks. And as a reminder, we will go one more week and then take a break. So next week's June 28th. We'll meet that day. July 5th, we will not meet for this group or our other Sunday morning activities. We will have worship that day. But for the July 4th weekend, we'll take a holy pause. And then we'll resume on July 12th with week 6 and then go forward the rest of this conversation. So just a reminder, next week we'll be here, and then July 5th is worship only. We'll take a break from formation activities that morning. But week 4 is this one, bearing one another, the church as a community of care. So we have been talking about this idea of being church, looking at the New Testament from the book of Acts forward primarily, but we're doing some, we'll jump back to the Old Testament and Gospels as well, but Acts and the Epistles primarily, and looking at what those people, those stories, those realities have to say to us about being the church now as they were exploring what it meant to be the church back then. So, as a reminder, we have gone through the first 3 weeks of looking at the church as a people. First week, called by God, not a place. We are grateful for a beautiful place to come together for worship and a remarkable resource of facility, but that's not what the church is. And I think we get to be a really interesting example of that because guess what? The chapel's not ours. The divinity school's not ours. We don't really have a building. We just get to be the church in this kind of nomadic way, sort of, although we're not totally wayward. But we're not bound to place in the ways that some people are. We're bound to community. That's really more of who we are. And so just the uniqueness of that being actually attached to the origin of what the church is. Week 2, God forms the church through shared practices. We are what we do in some ways, as well as what we believe, but we don't stop at just what we believe. And that if our doing is not aligned to our believing, then something is amiss. But we are formed through our shared practices, what we do individually, what we do corporately and collectively. Last week, the church is one body composed of many gifts and perspectives. So we are seeking unity, not uniformity, is the line I always like to use, and recognizing that we have distinctives and differences that are not to be discarded in our search for being one, but actually held together in celebration of each, whether you are a pinky or a thumb or an ear or an eye or a toe or a head or a knee, right? In the metaphor of the body, we need all of it to work together. And so we reminded ourselves last week that the church's diversity is not a problem to manage. It is the point. God builds one body out of people who would never naturally choose each other, and that is itself a witness. This is not a group we've kind of just, this isn't, PE recess kickball where we've chosen each other to be on our team, and we just came together and we happened to be here, and the happening of us together, each of us as a collective, becomes something remarkable. Last week, most human communities are built on sameness. We sort ourselves, right? We talked about kind of your identifiable jersey that we choose to wear, your neighborhood, your income, your education, your politics, your taste, your age. We don't necessarily choose all of those, but we do on some level. The church is supposed to be different, not because Christians are more virtuous, but because something happened in baptism that reorganized who belongs together. And we asked ourselves that question last week. And then we worked through Colossians and Romans and Corinthians last week and reminded ourselves of an ethic of community life that Paul was constructing through those. These 4 things: love without pretense, which is quite something to consider, unhypocritical and maskless, outdo one another in showing honor rather than something else, weep with those who weep, do not be haughty, associate with the lowly. Hopefully you've not been accused of being haughty lately, but if so, at least it's a fun word to say. And then kind of ended last week thinking about this image of the body is beautiful, but it's also demanding. Body's not a collection of independent parts that happen to share a space. A body is a system of mutual dependence, and actually there's a word I like for this, interdependence, where the suffering of one part is felt throughout, where no member can afford indifference to the others, where the most visible parts need the least visible ones to function at all. We talked about whether there are parts of the church that are dispensable, and we remind ourselves that there aren't, that no part is more important than the other. One may seem more visible, right? One may seem more upfront, but the background, the hidden tasks, the smaller parts, the quieter parts are just as indispensable as the rest. We talked about the forest last week, right? The idea of the forest, that even trees of a different species will help each other for the sake of the forest at large. The ways that they help one another. What the church is called to be. Not a gathering of like-minded people, to the point that I don't think we could choose a topic and all 100% agree on any of it, right? But a gathering of like-minded people, not a gathering of like-minded people who enjoy similar things, not a spiritual service provider for individual consumers. We talked about that a little bit last week. But a body, one body, made of people who would never otherwise choose each other, held together not by affinity, but by baptism, and by the one in whom we are all clothed, reminding ourselves of Paul's clothing language, particularly Colossians chapter 3. Clothe yourself with kindness and gentleness and all these things. Meekness. This week, we're moving forward into how we care for one another. All one body, right? And so if we are the body and the toe gets stubbed and it's hurting, care for the toe. Or if you roll off your lawnmower and break your shoulder, you got to care for the shoulder. So thinking of a body metaphor as we look at the church, care in the church is not a program or a committee, although we do have those things, but it's a structural feature of what the church is. Bearing burdens, confessing failures, seeking healing are not optional extras layered onto real church life. They're the thing itself. So question. When you think of a time someone in a church bore your burden, what did that actually look like? Not in theory, not abstract, but what did the person do when one of your burdens has been borne by another? What did that look like? What was that? Any examples?
It's not in church. My nephew carried my pack 2 miles at the end of the last day we were able to hike because I couldn't.
Yeah. Sometimes quite literally shouldering a burden that you can't physically carry any longer, even if it's temporary, for sure. What else? Whether that's in church or in a community that represents this very idea that we're talking about.
I think of having our 3 kids in 3 different states amidst 3 different congregations, and who created the meal train and fed us during those periods were always church community members.
Yeah. We've been the recipients of a good old-fashioned Southern pounding. Right? Pound of this, pound of that. Yeah. Sounds not very compassionate or careful, but it's quite nice, actually.
When I had my heart surgery, first of all, the quilt I got presented in the hospital is still in my family room and always there. But then it was that same thing where we had meals and visits, and I will never forget Carol, Greg, I was griping about the fact that I couldn't walk during the day because Jeff was off at work, and they wouldn't let me go by myself, and so she came over in her heels and suit and walked with me in my neighborhood, and then enticed other people from the church to do that as well. So that, those were just all the really wonderful ways to bear a burden of something that was really scary. So, and all is well. So
my granddaughter, Amelia, took 50 hours to be born. Meanwhile, the mama, Kayla, is being asked every 5 minutes, it seemed to her, do you want a C-section? Should we do a C-section? And she just knew that baby was on its way and no C-section was going to stop it. But a prayer request went out. Linda was in touch with me, Linda Caroline. And she was in touch, and she put a prayer request out to the prayer request group, and I could feel it almost immediately. It was a really challenging, you hear on Friday, oh, she's going into labor. You think it's going to happen by the next morning, or at least late afternoon on Saturday. And you're thinking, this is the nightmare. This is the nightmare you don't want anyone to experience. Yeah, and the love that came from that.
Yeah, it's powerful. So we have not just a idea of an abstract concept, right? We have remembrances of these things we've experienced where people, there's the metaphor of walking alongside each other, but sometimes it's literally walking alongside someone, right? We know what it means to kind of show up in different ways, whether that is in the act of a prayer, the act of a meal, the act of shouldering something physically. I mean, there are ways in which we can identify this in our lives in some way. And many times, not always, and not even as always as it should be, but the church is a representative symbol of that in its best way of being. The church is the place where this happens just naturally and out of a response to something. Oh,
I'll give one more quick too. Just it's Father's Day, and my father passed just a little over a year ago.
Yeah.
But at that time too, just I was on the search committee, and no one here knew my father. He was from Missouri, and it's probably one of those more kind of complicated aspects as well that you had mentioned. But just having numerous people just reach out who had read his obituary and just pulled something from that and made a comment or just mentioned something. It was just, just knew that the community was there and helped to bear the burden of of a lost father.
yeah. Absolutely. So we're going to take 3 movements. Thank you for sharing, by the way. And I hope you'll consider, as we talk through all of this, where this has intersected your actual lived experience, as some of you have just shared. We're going to take 3 movements through 3 different texts today. And the first one is Acts chapter 4. We've spent some time in Acts chapter 2 looking at some framing of all of this conversation. But we're going to look to see kind of what some of this looked like. And this is referring back to some of what we saw in Acts chapter 2 already. But this is a passage you probably are somewhat familiar with, perhaps. Acts chapter 4, 32 to 37 says, "Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul. And no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them. For as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. There was a Levite from Cyprus, Joseph, to whom the apostles gave the name Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. He sold a field that belonged to him, then brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet." So we've got 3 kind of movements in here to unpack a little bit. And it's a pretty radical text that sometimes is used or looked at and with some sneering and some other ways, the way it gets looked at in modern settings. But this idea of all things kind of held together, right? There's this all things common, all things shared together principle that we start seeing in Acts chapter 2. It's unpacked here in Acts chapter 4, really lived into this experience. And we have these, that no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own. So first it was this sense of not just mine and yours, but ours, right? So we're shifting a mindset of not just who belongs, which is a part of the conversation of the church all throughout the epistles, but kind of what belongs to whom and to the church and to even us at all. Then there's pretty remarkable claim, there was not a needy person among them. Making an empirical claim, Luke is doing, not a sentimental one. People sold property, laid the proceeds at the apostles' feet for distribution. As a reminder, we said this in Acts chapter 2, but we said this when we were talking about the idea of the temple. This echoes Deuteronomy 15, chapter 4, or 15, verse 4. There'll be no poor among you. Language describing the ideal of Israel's covenant life. If you go back to Deuteronomy 14 and 15, you start reading through the kind of the concept and the construct of the temple idea, you have this language, there will not be any poor among you. So Luke is now saying, and Luke is author of the Gospel of Luke and also the Acts of the Apostles. This is happening. The church is becoming what Israel was called to do. And so let's go back to this really quickly before we dive into it any further. What strikes you in this text, 32 through 37? What stands out to you? What is challenging about this, encouraging about this, unusual about this? Anything. What stands out to you about Acts chapter 4, 32 through 37?
Our whole society is geared to our own ownership of property. And our government and all our institutions, it's difficult to have a whole large group of people consider giving to people in need.
This is radically countercultural,
Yes.
right? Not just that day, which it would have been, but especially today, even more so. So this idea of that we would in any way kind of let go of a sense of ownership of possessions and think more about the collective. Yeah, that's radically countercultural. Yes.
You know, I'm trying to figure out how to say it. I think the idea that still persists, even though you're right, we own our own property, etc. But somewhere I was taught that everything comes from God. We don't earn it. It is from God. And that's why I was taught that I would give back. And most especially to the church, which I hoped, and in most instances, did that work to help the poor, to be with people. And that's why that's a part of my Christianity. I hope that's not too weird.
Well, I think some would argue this is weird, right? I mean, this is a weird way to frame all this. Anybody familiar with the Catholic workers movement? Dorothy Day.
Yes.
This is very much, that whole movement was built on this very idea, which was kind of this, it was the Catholic workers movement was this idea of a community brought together where essentially, if you were coming into that community, you would set yourself at the level of the kind of the lowest among them, and if you were bringing in gifts and possessions, it was to share with the community. They would live among one another at a common place. Actually, I've got an excerpt about this. Dorothy Day, journalist, activist after her conversion to Catholicism in the early 1930s, co-founded this movement during the Depression, so let's keep the context in mind. The vision was simple and demanding: live in voluntary poverty, hold property and resources in common, and offer direct hospitality to the poor, not through a charity at arm's length, but by living alongside the people being helped. And so it was this idea that if you joined this, you gave up personal wealth, lived at the same material level as the people that you were there to serve. It wasn't a program administered to the poor, it was a household shared with them. So it was very much this very kind of realized exploration of what this might look like. And it was challenging and radical, and people had lots of things to say about it, but it was powerful. And Dorothy Day is well remembered for a great many things, but this being part of that, trying to bring together this very concept in a lot of ways. Anything else stand staying out of it. This.
Yes, this is leave the me world behind. It's St. Francis' 4-year struggle to get rid of his everything, to go to become a monk. 4-year struggle. It's not overnight. It's not one day. So this is, to me, this is a constant pondering. Leave my me world behind, little by little, to relinquish, to become heart and soul and body to the new country. That's God's kingdom.
Yeah. Thank you, Maya. There's a constancy to all of this, right? There's a persistence to this idea that's not just it's not a one-time act of let me do this thing one time and then move on. It's this sense of what life is meant to be lived on in perpetuity in some way. Doug, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, there's two sides to this. It's so unfathomable to think that there was not a needy person among them, and that
Right.
looking at the needs that we have that are so great and the disparity among the world, that's how could we ever reach that? But Alexander's just really obsessed right now with the globe and the world and asking questions about countries and why are some countries poor, why are some rich?
Love kids.
And it's unfathomable that we have enough resources. I mean, right? Like it's so. I mean, we all live in this world, and I get it. No person need. What would that look like? So different. But I mean, but also, how do you explain it to a child that that it's supposed to be okay like this, and it's not, right? And Adora as well. Just even at the different ages, trying to make sense of these different approaches and what they're doing in the youth group, and these things are. So I don't have the answers, but it's just these extremes. It's so hard to reconcile that what it would take to have no one in need, but yet we have to live in that reality. How can we accept it not and explain it to if you can't explain it to a child and it makes sense, then how can you explain it? I don't know. When we get,
I think the one thing I was able to, I don't know, maybe even Bruce or Sam Wells said something like this, but my kids, when they were in youth group here, they were asking those questions too.
Could you speak up just a little bit?
I can only speak as much as I can. I'm so sorry. And I just don't have the breath. What I wanted to say is, somebody said at that time, there's all this need out there, and we always seem to have money for bombs and not for schooling or lunches or the impoverished healthcare. But that's why we're here on earth. We're supposed to be the hands. And look when you can do it. Doesn't mean you have to sacrifice yourself to do it, or your family, but look when you can do it.
So part of what was said is just that this idea that we live in a world where there seems to be money for certain things. Bombs was the example given. Not always schooling or resources are needed, but that's part of why we're here. And I think part of the we in that is us individually who profess a faith in something greater and bigger, but also the church. There's only so much we can really do about systems of the different, empires of the day, right? This is a text coming out of one. And we can do as much as we can about, political systems and national systems and other countries, but one way to think about this is if we aren't starting with ourselves, we aren't starting with the church, how do we ever expect the rest of the world to be impacted by people and groups that aren't doing this to begin with, even though this is part of the faith they profess, right? So it's this idea that, we're here to try to make a difference, knowing that at some point we're always fighting against a world, and that this is a global problem, and this isn't just a individual church problem. It's not a North Carolina problem, not a United States problem. It is a global reality that we hold these things, and it's a challenge because we do look in the world and see where there is abundance in some ways and dramatic scarcity in the others, and 1 + 1 over here doesn't equal 2 in the way we wish that it might. But hopefully, the church becomes this thing that begins to represent something different.
Well, and Ryan, one thing real quick too, just that I had read in a time such as this, that we are feeling particularly overwhelmed and paralyzed and helpless. Like what can we do? I found it helpful to read someone's comment that and kind of like Kimberly was saying, do it when you can, how you can, that we cannot fix all the problems. But if you are able to focus and find one organization that does something you feel passionate about, again, back to last week, we're all different parts of the body, right? So we all have different passions and ways that we can plug in and make a difference. It's not our job to change everything, but to find that one lane that we can plug into and do our part, then as the body, we can create change.
Amen.
Well, and somebody said to us one time, a pastor friend of ours actually, that, you know, in a conversation about, you know, there's so much in the world we wish we could do, you know, and try to engage with, and it just feels like there's only so much we have capacity for. And they said, well, don't discredit the significant work you're doing as parents of young children, trying to raise them in a way that believes this and becomes people who try to live. But that's a cause worthy of fighting for. That's, you know, don't sell yourself short because you're not doing all these other things. They know what we believe as a family and said, you know, you're trying to raise kids who are, you know, built on stuff like this, and that's we need more people willing to do that kind of work, right? And so there are these ways in which we all become a part of this together. One body, many parts, right? So this question may be one that we hold more in reflection, but you may have a response to this. But and again, listen, let me. Oh, it's not there. It's in my notes, but on my screen. A couple of things before we ask this question. Let's be careful not to fully romanticize Acts chapter 4, but also not to dismiss it. There's a couple of things I want to hold us to honestly. One, this was almost certainly not a permanent, fully institutionalized economic system. Acts chapter 6 shows distribution problems. If you go back to the retreat that some of us were a part of with Mindy several weeks ago, we talked about Acts chapter 6, where they were having issues doing this very thing 2 chapters later, right? They were struggling with, you know, how to do it, and then the inclusion of more people. The more they moved this circle from, okay, we're going to do this here, but now we're going to do it here, and then here, and the more those circles moved outward, the more complicated this became. They were having distribution problems. And Ananias, Sapphira, chapter 5, show it wasn't kind of coerced or universal. They didn't start doing this and it all just went perfectly, and it's like, well, gosh, why can't we just be like the apostles in chapter 4? Like they struggled with this. It was just hard for them to do. So let's just remind ourselves that, you know, it's not like we're just falling short and they weren't. This is hard. This is hard work. But the text isn't describing an experiment that failed. It's describing what happens when people take seriously that everything belongs to God and to each other. So it's more of this mindset we're moving ourselves to, understanding that it's never going to, not this side of heaven, it's probably never going to be perfect. It's never going to be always a success. There's going to be struggle and failure, but if we are moving in the direction of taking seriously that everything belongs to God and to one another, this idea that we have this mutual interdependence, something else begins to really take shape. So I want to say that just that, you know, it's not like, oh, gosh, we're not the Acts 4 church, and therefore we're not a church. Let's do the best we can, and let's start with a grounding on something that we often fall away from and see where that takes us. That said, what might it look like for there to be no needy person among this congregation? How do we even begin to think about that from an abstract place to a practical, realized one in our own context? And I don't have a list of answers to this question. I'm just curious. When we take this idea from the abstract to the concrete, what does that look like even right here and now? Any thoughts about that? Ken?
I just had this question about a discretionary fund. You know, administratively, how does this work? You know, I think I've been in situations where we've had something like a deacon's fund where people can contribute to that, and then it's administered by a group of people in response to needs in the congregation.
Yeah. I've been connected to quite a few, sometimes benevolence funds, they're sometimes called, or discretionary funds, and And there are challenges to that, but there's a lot of good in that. And yeah, that's an interesting. One of the ways I've seen that most effective is when a group of churches say, we're going to do that together in some way and kind of pull our resources in a kind of area of kind of benevolence, thinking about our, for example, when I was in Atlanta, I was a part of a church that historically had just their own benevolence fund. And then they're in the middle of Atlanta, Peachtree Road in Buckhead. There were 6 other churches around them, big churches that all had the same thing. And 30 years ago, they said, we're all doing these things without knowing what the left and the right hands are doing, and we're kind of duplicating efforts, and it's not working. So they came together and they actually formed a partnered ministry called Buckhead Christian Ministries that was born out of all 6 of their churches saying, we're going to pull together resources and we're going to support this thing ongoing as a way of saying, together we're going to share things together with our community right here and kind of do some things. And that's worked really well. And then there are other churches that do kind of the more individual approach. But I think you're right. That could be something that could be interesting. Here, we have a discretionary fund that's kind of very specific. But it could be interesting to think, what does it look like as we engage the community more largely? Yeah.
The Durham Urban Ministries, to me, is an inspiring example of exactly what you were just talking about. I mean, I'm not sure if it's just churches that have come together, but there are a lot of churches involved, but it's a consolidated effort to do something specific and concrete, and what they do is just really inspiring to me, and it's obviously reaching out to a need in the community too. So.
Saw a hand over here.
I guess a local example that I don't think many of us know enough about, the Rupa House, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrave here in Durham. A decade or 2 ago, he led a retreat for us, but not specifically on that topic. But my impression is they are living in community, literally trying to fulfill acts, and the best of my knowledge, they're still doing it.
I think an interesting way to think about this question is not just what would it look like, but what has it looked like? What does it look like? What are the examples of this we see in and around our congregation? Where are the places where we perhaps don't see this, and how could there be a way to meet needs? And I think it's one that it's a question for us that we should keep putting before ourselves, not as a one-time thing, but as a continuous act of what does it look like for our congregation to be striving toward this idea of no needy person amongst, knowing that we're not striving for perfection, although that would be wonderful, but we're striving, right? At the very least, we're striving. And so are we doing all we can with all that we have and all the ways that we have them to do this?
Well, I think it almost begs the question of what is the definition of needy and how are we defining needy, right? Because I can't help but think about you and I living and working in Cape Town, working in the township of Red Hill, not together, separately. We went to Cape Town, and and I've heard so many youth speak of how their mindset is blown when they come home from a mission trip or something, right? Because there's this community of people who live together and are so full of joy despite their lack of resources. And so I think for our congregation in particular, what needy would look like is vulnerability. Because I think when you do have resources and when you do have this facade that you feel like you have to present, or expectation perhaps but to share troubled moments and to not just mask them and hide them is a true way to come together and build community and lift one another up.
One of the advantages of not having a building is we don't have to pay for one.
Right.
So we have some pretty incredible contributions that we're making, and where other people are financing their hands.
Right.
Another way to look at this, I don't know if I'm going to be on your track or not, but money is not necessarily the definition of wealth or poverty. There's a poverty that
money can't fix. And there's a wealth that you can't
Right.
achieve with money.
Right.
And
Well said.
that's the way I
Yeah.
sort of took your,
And I think keeping all that in mind is that this conversation is that this is not one thing. This conversation is not about one thing. It's layered. It is about material need. It's also about spiritual need. You said earlier, Luke's not, he's being empirical, not sentimental. There is a reality in which maybe it's not sentimental, but it is both empirical and material and spiritual, right? And so as long as we're holding those things, and that this is both, addressing who are the needy among us, it's easy to immediately go towards material needs. But one of the things we began this conversation by doing is sharing our prayer requests with one another, the ways in which we need each other during moments of just life realities and the mental, emotional, physical ways in which we have needs beyond just material possession of these things. And so it's a layered conversation that doesn't have one approach, which is why it actually becomes attached to this larger sense of the church as a whole, the community at large, all the ways we do this. How do we hold all things together? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Nelson, I saw your hand up. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, well,
I saw your hand back there.
you sort of covered what I was going to say. There are a lot of people in our community who have emotional needs.
Yes.
A lot of people
Yes.
are isolated.
Yes.
They're more isolated
Right.
seniors than ever before. But a lot of these people don't reach out to us. But I had a conversation at a Juneteenth event with a man, and I started a conversation. I didn't know him, he didn't know me. But just talking with him, we both had the same physical difficulty, which it wasn't a major, like cancer or something. But just talking with him, I think, helped both of us. So it's like reaching out to people who might be going through something.
Yeah. And there's a tendency in these conversations that I want us to be careful with, to begin to feel some sense of like guilt or church shaming of, look at all, we're not doing enough, we're not being enough, we aren't enough, which is it's a very worldly thing to kind of get sucked into. And that's appropriate for us to pay attention to where maybe there are needs, there are gaps, there are opportunities, of course. But it's how do you hold together the reality is, okay, there are things we can celebrate and be grateful for and acknowledge that we're doing. There's also, we need to acknowledge the places where we could do, there are needs, there are gaps, we could do more, there are other opportunities we haven't, and we don't do that as a way of saying, well, gosh, we're failing as a church. No, we are always looking for ways to continue to move more fully into this, whether this is exploring different kinds of ways we use funding, different ways we engage, pastoral community care of the congregation with one another, of identifying, the needs of our people where we maybe aren't aware of them, and then recognizing what is not just within our community, but beyond it too. And so I think we have to be careful that this is not simply an exercise to just, be really hard on ourselves and grade ourselves poorly, but to say, are we always striving towards the opportunity to do more of this, to do a more full expression of this? And we're okay with continuing to keep our eyes open and our arms wide to what else, what more, how else, and to think that's the posture of moving towards greater abundance of this rather than simply getting sucked into the scarcity of it. Does that make sense?
Christ gives us grace.
Right, and then thank God, literally, that grace abounds. Let me move forward a good bit just for the sake of time. There's two other texts I want us to point to, and then a couple of questions at the end. And there's something I hope I have time to read to you. My brothers and sisters, this is Galatians chapter 6. If anyone is detected in a transgression, you who have received the Spirit should restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. Take care that you yourselves are not tempted. Bear one another's burdens. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. Okay, we can stop right there. Bear one another's burdens. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. For if those who are nothing think they are something, they deceive themselves. All must test their own work, then that work, rather than their neighbor's work, will become a cause for pride. For all must carry their own loads. So now we get to this point where we say, well, hang on a second. Verse 2, bear one another's burdens. Verse 5, all must carry their own loads. What do we do with verse 2 and verse 5? The Greek word for burdens, baros, means a weight too heavy to carry alone. Paul isn't talking about minor inconveniences. He means the things that crush a person. Grief, failure, illness, shame, financial collapse, addiction, despair. Verse 5, for all must carry their own load. Okay, Paul, what are you talking about? A different word here, fortion, the ordinary load each person is responsible for. Paul is not contradicting himself. He's distinguishing between burdens too heavy for one person, which the community must help carry, and ordinary responsibility, which no one else can do for you. Any responses to that? Any thoughts about this distinction rather than a contradiction? Is that helpful?
Yes.
And what are you hearing in that?
I guess for people who are bashful, reluctant, introverted, and asking for help with little things, they need a dose of courage or whatever to ask for help on the big things.
Yeah. There's a couple of things here. One is there's a word called paternalism in the world, which those of us so my master's degree is around kind of the global movement of the church through kind of church mission work. This idea that we have to be careful not doing for others what they can do for themselves. The idea isn't let me go paint a wall that somebody could otherwise paint for themselves. But how do we build relationships and partnerships that help equip and empower people in ways that are Christ-filled and grace-filled and all these other things? But there's also this sense that, this idea of bearing one another's burdens, sharing all things in common, doesn't relinquish everyone from their own individual responsibilities of doing for themselves the thing which they can do for themselves, right? This isn't just, oh, great, there's a church who's doing all this, I can be a freeloader, right? Not to be dismissive. But there's a distinction that matters pastorally here. Care that tries to carry someone's ordinary load for them, doing for them what they need to do for themselves, isn't care, it's enabling. And it can rob someone of dignity. But refusing to help carry a genuine burden under the banner of they need to handle their own stuff is the opposite failure. It's abandonment dressed up as respect for autonomy. Do you see that? Yes. We hold those two things together, right? So paying attention to and even helping people understand an own sense of agency, ability, empowering rather than enabling, right? But then also recognizing that's a place in which that isn't theirs to just tighten up their bootstraps and try harder. It's like that's where they need something that they can't carry themselves, and I can step there rather than I'm going to do for somebody that they should be doing for themselves. So we have to hold this thing together, and so Paul is trying to do those things with verse 2 and verse 5. So I want you to hang on to this question. We're running it short on time, but how do you tell the difference in practice between a burden someone needs help carrying and a load they need to carry themselves? So just hold that, right? Because that can be challenging individually, within your own family systems, within your relationships, within a church system, any systems.
And how to make sure you're not judging that person.
And how do we do so without judgment, with grace? Right. And so, and again, none of this is perfect, but there's a balance we're trying to find here where it's not just, let's just do for everybody so nobody has to do for themselves. No. Carry the loads you can carry. Have people and everybody else help carry the loads you can't. Right? Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why in the past, I don't know what the relevance for today is, but in the past, so many churches established universities and educational efforts to help people help themselves. Yeah. And I don't know what the equivalent is for the moment or for today, but historically it had real importance of church action related to this issue.
Well, there's some great examples, and that's it, helping people even have the resources to then acquire skills, resources, knowledge, information, things to do some things for themselves that they couldn't otherwise do without some of those equipping resources, empowering resources. So there are some churches who've taken very seriously this opportunity for helping people understand personal financial management. Like, how do we help people understand? I was a part of a church in New York that helped families in communities that were having a hard time with economic prosperity, but also with food and food resources. They started doing these cooking classes that were also built around helping people understand the value of not just nutritionally, but economically preparing a meal for yourself versus going to buy a meal from McDonald's. And helping equip people with information and skill sets and knowledge to say, there are ways we can help you help yourself. And we can help equip each other. So there's, again, it's layered upon layered upon layered upon layered. Let me jump forward a couple more. Paul's posture is one of restoring them gently, by the way. Gentleness is important. He says that in Colossians already. Watch yourselves so you're not tempted. This is not confrontation from a position of moral superiority. It assumes the one helping is equally capable of falling. Care and humility are tied together. You cannot have one without the other. There's this sense in which, I'm not going to have time to read this whole section, but there's a book called Theirs is the Kingdom, written by a guy named, what is his name? Bob Lupton. And he's the one who wrote the book Toxic Charity, that you may know that book. But he says, he's talking about working with the poor in inner city Atlanta. He says, when my goal is to change people, I subtly communicate, something's wrong with you, I am okay. You are ignorant, I am enlightened. You are wrong, I am right. If our relationship is defined as healer to patient, I must remain strong and you must remain sick for our interaction to continue. People don't go to doctors when they are well. This idea that that it assumes one helping is equally capable of falling. There's this mutual understanding of, in this moment I'm helping you, but the next moment you may be helping me, and that's okay, right? It's not dependent on, I'm the caregiver, you're the care receiver always. That this doctor-patient reality lived here. We need doctors, by the way. But it's this idea of, you understand, I think, what I'm getting at. Let's jump ahead, James chapter 5. This is our last text for today. We'll wrap up here in just a minute. Are any among you suffering? They should pray. Are any cheerful? They should sing songs of praise. Are any among you sick? They should call for the elders of the church and have them pray over them, anointing them with the oil in the name of the Lord. The prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise them up. Anyone who has committed sins will be forgiven. Therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another, so that you may be healed. The prayer of the righteous is powerful and effective. You see where we're going here. We've moved from what are our possessions that belong to each other to, are we confessing with each other? Are we praying with each other? Are we holding some of these things spiritually together? Many among you, brothers and sisters, wanders from the truth is brought back by another. You should know that whoever brings back a sinner from wandering will save the sinner's soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. We're responsible with and for one another. Suffering, prayer, sickness, elders, anointing, all these movements, nothing here is meant to be done alone. Private and public, countercultural instructions of the New Testament, confession in most of contemporary life is one of these two things, if we're doing it at all. But James describes something different. Confession to one another inside a community small and trustworthy enough to bear it, for the purpose of healing rather than exposure or performance. And then here's the last thing I want us to see, which we're now running out of time for. There's through this whole conversation, which we could have for weeks upon weeks just on this, three kind of movements that I think are key to this idea. One, Acts 4 describes a community where need was eliminated because ownership was redefined. Galatians 6 describes a community where burdens are carried together, but no one's dignity is taken from them in the process. How do we work on that, right? James 5 describes a community honest enough that confession leads to healing rather than exposure. 2, none of this happens by accident. None of it happens through a program. It happens when people decide again and again that they belong to each other. not just in feeling, but in practice, and what gets shared and what gets carried and what gets confessed and forgiven. Now, from that, we can build out, systems and resources and things, but this happens intentionally through a shared approach to all of this. And then third, this is costly. Paul says so plainly, don't grow weary. He says it because he knows you'll be tempted to. The whole point of bearing this together is that none of us is meant to sustain it alone, including the burden of caring for others. So this, as was pointed out, this is ongoing, consistent, persistent work. It's not easy. We're going to fail. It's layered upon what have we already talked about? Who we are and what we do. So this idea of what we believe and what we do and who we are and how we hold these things together, it all becomes built around a foundation that is stronger than just, oh, we have a committee for that, or we have a program for that. Well, do we have an entire church ecosystem built around this? Do we have a framework that shapes every part of what we do so that it's woven into every committee and program and activity and relationship and engagement of the church, right? It's not to say that programs and committees are bad. Bearing one another's burden is not what the church does on top of being the church. It's part of what makes it one. This is foundational stuff. This is at the very kind of structure of who we are. Any last comments before we close? Because I know we're wildly out of time. Wildly so. Any other comments? And again, we will keep talking about this. We'll pick this up next week. And we'll keep talking about this over the next 6 weeks because this is all attached to what we're talking about. But probably kind of raced through the end there, but I wanted to get to those last three framings. So let me close us in prayer. Thank you for your contributions today. Thank you for the ways you are up to the task, that you care about this, that you're willing to think boldly together about how do we do this? What does this look like for us? Why does it matter? Well, let's pray together and we'll go to worship and explore that more through the way we worship God. Lord, you have called us to bear what is too heavy to carry alone. Forgive us when we hide our burdens or ignore the burdens of others. Give us courage to confess and grace to help carry. Let no one among us be needy and unseen. Amen. Go in peace. Good to be with you today. Thank you for those of you online. Glad you're here from all over the world. We're glad that our West Coast folks are here, East Coast folks are here. We got all kinds of things. Thanks for being here.